Hi, welcome to Human. I am here with Alex Plitsas, who's still putting the final touches on his camera. He leads a counterterrorism program inside the Atlantic Council. He was also previously the chief of sensitive activities for special operations and combating terrorism in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He was detailed to the intel community to represent the Pentagon. He was also previously deployed to Iraq, where he led a psychological operation team. He was also deployed to Afghanistan as a strategic planner for the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Quite the background. Alex and I have known each other for a couple years now, too. And you had told me that you were going to Syria. You came back, and we want to learn all about it. So, can you just start, Alex, by telling us about what you were doing in Syria?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. It was actually quite a nice surprise to be able to go. So I was in Iraq last year for the Middle East Peace and Security Forum. I was with a number of Syrian scholars who were ethnic Syrians who had some had done time in regime prison, and lamenting, looking across the border into Syria, that we would, never be able to get to Damascus in our lifetime. And then 3 weeks later, the country had fallen, which was, complete shock to most folks who were watching it happen so quickly. So fast forward about 9 months later, and as the new government formed inside Syria, several former colleagues in the Atlantic Council, Hind, who's now the minister for social welfare and labor, and then Qutaiba, who is the spokesman and Western Affairs and Israeli Affairs portfolio holder over at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we had a number of folks who landed over there, and the timing lined up for most folks, I think, would describe it as like a track 2 delegation. So it's former officials who are traveling in the capacity as a think tank, but officially invited to be there for engagements with the government. So it provided us with an opportunity to get a chance to see the country, and then get a chance to meet with the government officials and get a feel for what was going on. And then speaking to obviously U.S. and Israeli and regional officials as well, both before and afterwards.
So, what did you see having the country change so drastically and as unexpectedly as it did? Um, what were your impressions of the country? What stood out to you?
So I think what stood out to me most was the perception that it was going to be walking into an extremely conservative, government that was attempting to enforce specific religious viewpoints and any socio-economic rules and regulations for society that would sort of come with. And I didn't find any of that. It was more traditional Syrian culture that we had sort of all come accustomed to learning about over the years, because Syria is still very much a secular society, just being so diverse in the population, with a significant breakdown of minorities between different Christian sects, the Shia, the Alawite subsect, the Sunnis, ethnic Kurds in the north. But for the most part, folks are still Syrian first. It's usually what city do they come from, where they are, and then you don't really get down to the ethnic and religious until sort of last in terms of identity. So that was fascinating to see. And then what I found was a technocratic government. So minus the security services and the military side of the house, everything else was was a lot of expatriates who were professionals, educated either in Syria or abroad, with very diverse work history and professional work histories that matched the requirements of the ministries. And we found, I think, a country really looking to emerge from war and looking to reconstruct, and a government that was looking to engage. So it was a surprising visit in a very good way, is probably the best way to put it. And then getting a chance to see the place without government minders. So we didn't have, little government issued interpreters or anybody else sort of following us around, sort of controlling conversations. Other than the meetings with the government officials, we were allowed to sort of move on our own without any supervision. So it made for real meaningful engagements with civilians from all walks of life in different areas, including outside of Damascus, who we didn't just get that bubble. So I think we got a pretty holistic view for what we could. Obviously, getting way up north where there's issues with the Kurds and the SDF, and then down south, where there were some issues with the Druze that were pretty well known in Sweda. We couldn't get there just given the fact that those were active combat zones, and they were sort of little pockets of control across the country. But we got as best a view as we could given where we were.
What were you seeing in the streets? So we talked a little bit about what's going on inside the government in terms of technocrats, people with knowledge, as you say,
Yeah.
leading some of these institutions right now. But everyday Syrians, what do they look like? What are they up to? How are they feeling?
That's a great question. Very optimistic. I found actually a very pro-U.S., actually very pro-President Trump mentality, and I was trying to kind of dissect where the feelings were coming from, their thoughts. They were extremely grateful to the president for lifting the sanctions, but that was another thing that was sort of a shock to most folks, that the sanctions had been lifted on paper but not in practice because of the bureaucracy that comes on the back end with doing that. So, I mean, we were still walking around with stacks of what I would call monopoly money to pay for basic items because the banking system hadn't been fully reintegrated into SWIFT yet. Western cell phones didn't work. They couldn't connect to the whatchamacallit, they couldn't connect to the network while you were there, right? So that was another, issue on the comm side. And you can't rebuild under those conditions, right? So you found folks really looking to re-engage with the world, to get connected, and to be free. And I think a lot of people failed to appreciate the oppression and repression that the Assad regime had imposed on the people there. So, I mean, you couldn't have a conversation about politics or anything else without secret police, who are sort of out in public in plain clothes, or security apparatus, snatching you up, taking you away for a couple of days, potentially torturing or detaining you. You couldn't basically travel more than a few blocks before the traffic cops were looking for bribes. There were pictures and posters of government officials all over the place during the Assad regime. All of that's gone. So the traffic cops that were there are gone. There's no more bribes. People are done. They're done. They're done playing that game with them. There are virtually no images of government officials anywhere across Damascus. There were a couple of billboards that were appropriate where it had like the president's face on it now, al-Sharaa, as he was preparing for a global gathering that was taking place in Syria, and a few other things. But by and large, all of those aspects that really bothered folks and were part of the repression from the previous regime were gone. And so the people really had enough. And there was a question from a lot of folks, where is the Syrian support for the new regime, the new government coming from? I think, again, people really failed to appreciate how brutal and terrible the Assad regime was in general terms, and how happy people were to be free of that. So I found women in tank tops with their hair down, walking next to women that were in full niqab dress. So, I mean, in terms of it's kind of scaled both directions. Our interpreter while we were there was a female Christian woman who had long, dark, curly hair, and she wore, a tight-fitting dress. We went into, some of the ministry meetings while we were there, and that description, I would have expected a little bit more, sort of pushback or anything. Granted, there were a few moments, some of the more conservative folks we dealt with, didn't necessarily want to shake hands with women that were there, but it wasn't a off-putting, condescending. It was literally just a cultural, religious, like, I'm just not going to touch you, quite literally. It's not appropriate. But otherwise, there was meaningful engagement. There was I didn't see anything to indicate that folks were having beliefs or things forced on them, and really just kind of a very free society. So I wasn't expecting the level of freedom that I saw, and a government that really wanted to align with the West and reform. It was almost as if it was too good to be true, but the evidence of it just kept manifesting itself everywhere that we went, which led me to believe that, it was genuine. And we can kind of hop into that when you have some more questions about stuff. But I was just very, at a strategic framing level, I was very surprised and very pleasantly surprised at what we ran into.
I'm curious, before I get into some of these other questions, what's happening with the prisons that were emptied out? Are they just open spaces, or are they being used in any capacity?
I mean, there's still government, functioning institutions there, right? So there's still people being arrested or detained for crimes or those things, just not wantonly like they were in the past. So some of the prisons I'm sure, would be used for appropriate actual detention of folks, but like the torture stuff and all of that, no. I mean, and a lot of the buildings were damaged as well afterwards as folks went in to try to free people. So the wholesale prison routine is a bygone era. That's no longer sort of a thing.
So this is the first election of Syria's parliament since
Yeah.
Assad was ousted. And according to the New York Times, quote, of the 119 seats announced, only 6 went to women and less than a dozen to religious and ethnic minorities. For some, the election results added to concerns that Syria is entering an era dominated by Sunni nationalism. The public didn't vote directly because the government said Syria still faces significant administrative challenges. Many people, for example, do not have identification and are displaced. What do you make of that?
I think it's all fairly accurate, to be honest with you. I mean, the majority of the ruling party are, they're Sunnis who have sort of taken charge. You do have aspects or areas of the country, rather, that are not unified or under control. So again, whether you have the area where the STF is up north, the Syrian Defense Forces, that's largely Kurdish controlled, or down south, and then how are they participating in the elections? Is that happening the right way, right? And all the normal monitoring that would sort of go on for that. And yeah, it was an indirect election to start with. And I did see a lot of the issues related to displacement too. So that was one of the things we talked about with Hind, the Minister of Social Welfare and Labor, and what she's dealing with. So a lot of the refugees were very excited to return home, believe it or not. Syrian refugees has been a big topic of discussion, whether it be in Europe, in the United States, other places, because there was a mass exodus, of refugees outside of the country after the war started. Millions of folks, but a lot of people started pouring back in, not realizing that the areas they came from may have largely been destroyed. So when we see images of Damascus, right, it's largely intact as a city. You don't see remnants of war in the city center or anywhere near that, because the government gave up before the rebels, now the current government, sort of made their way to the city. But a lot of places outside of Damascus saw pretty brutal fighting. So when the refugees returned, they returned to ruined homes and had nowhere to go. And so there's an inordinate amount of, sort of homeless folks or orphans that are running around, in the country that wouldn't have traditionally been the case, that the government's trying to figure out what to do with. And then they also had the prison camps that were left over from the ISIS times from Al-Hol up north, and the issues that resulted from the widows and children of those radicalized fighters who were left behind as well. So they do have a pretty significant social issue that they have to deal with related to refugee return and the population of folks who are related to the war. And quite frankly, until the banking system gets back online, which it's now slowly starting to do, and the reconstruction funds show up, the refugees returning is actually problematic because the area is destroyed. So for a lot of folks there's two sides of the argument, right? There are people who say it's an absolute responsibility of the West and other folks to help rebuild because it's the right thing to do. And so whether if you're on that side of the coin or hey, I want the refugees out of my country and I want them to go back, no matter which side of the coin you come from, it leads to the same point. Without there being reconstruction inside the country and providing a stable environment, there are some areas where they literally cannot send refugees back to. So that's something that's going to need to be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, you need to have the funds for the
Yeah.
reconstruction, and I mean, the country needs that money, absolutely.
Yeah.
But when it comes to representing different facets of a very diverse population in Syria,
Yep.
to see whether or not those people will actually have a seat at the table when it comes to making decisions. I mean, we're talking about HTS, which was a
Yep.
designated terrorist organization.
Yep.
There had been a bounty for al-Sharaa. And so the question so many people have asked is this genuine? Or
Sure.
are we seeing, um, a mirage in real time? Or is this an inspiring new path for reform jihadists that everybody would love to have a good story on?
Yeah, I think some of the message that I delivered while I was there was the same thing we'd hear anywhere else. The campaign to retake the country, whether you want to look at that as a political event or not, because it was obviously enforced through fighting, right? It was essentially a campaign to take over the country without a democratic election, but with support from the people for an insurgency that rose up to basically overthrow the government, and they're there now. And so you get this sense of a little bit of confusion and bewilderment and between our view of that and that question. And let me explain to you what I mean by that, because what was said to me and kind of what I said in return. You get the feeling that, hey, the defense minister, when sat across the desk, first of all, we're about the same age. It was quite entertaining. We were able to have a little banter, a couple former soldiers now across the table as we're chatting. And you got this sense of, we took care of a lot of the enemies on the ground for everybody, right? In terms of Hezbollah that was sent in to fight to help support Assad, helped overthrow the Assad regime on the ground. The Russians were in there bombing. They're now gone. A whole host of issues. And the defense minister says, look, you're usually 80% aligned with any country at any given time, but we're nearly 100% aligned with the United States and other regional parties in the sense that Hamas supported Hezbollah and all of them. They're not, and Iran, because of, the support that they had for Hamas as an institution. The Russians were also supporting the Assad regime and bombing people. So if you look at the folks that they've been sort of fighting against and don't support, where you have the Russians, the Iranians, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of the actors that the U.S. and other Western allies have been sort of dealing with, we're aligned with you guys is the message I'm getting in terms of that, that being a common enemy. And my response was what you usually get, right? The campaigns are great, and then it's time to govern. You took over. Israel's been around in a modern state since 1948. The U.S., obviously, since the late 1700s. We've got policy track records. You can read us as a country and who we are. You're a new government. the war is over and you actually have to govern now. So, saying all the right things, aligning, the logic is there, it all makes sense. And I believe the conversations were genuine, particularly about regional peace as well. They're like, we're not a threat to Israel. We have no desire to go to war with them. We
Yeah,
want to
and
exist
I
as
do want to
neighbors.
break down some of these countries you're
Sure,
mentioning. Why don't we start with Russia? Because
sure.
Russia had an incredibly important role to play in
Yeah.
boosting the Assad regime and then using bases there, very strategic location for
Sure.
them. To what extent has al-Sharaa and his leadership allowed Russia space to operate?
So they haven't been given space to operate, from what I've been able to tell in terms of literal operation inside the country like they were previously. There are, however, historic relationships and, and contractual obligations for military hardware and a military that's been equipped with Russian military equipment for a long time that sort of still has to be dealt with, which will give the Russians an inroad to a certain extent for some time. The Russians were also literally printing the cash for them, the hard currency for quite some time, which also gave them control. There was a desire to shift that out and move that to Europe, but that required the sanctions being lifted. So there was like a lot of little things that were giving hooks to foreign powers in different ways to sort of control the situation on the ground, and that's sort of
And
being
I would
unwound.
imagine that the Russians would want to exploit those little pieces of
100%.
leverage that they have.
I mean, they have, because everybody looks at the issues we've had with Russia over the last 20, 30, 40 years as micro events in their own microcosm, which is not the case. So if we look at Ukraine in 14, they took Crimea because they wanted Sevastopol, which was the only warm water port there in the Black Sea, where the Fifth Fleet was, or excuse me, where the Black Fleet was based out of, to be able to transit the Bosphorus and counter NATO forces in the Mediterranean. Right. The same thing. You have the port of Tartus, where the Russians had a naval base as well, so it gave them the ability to project power. So in a lot of these cases, they weren't. I mean, even now, right? Like the Rush. Oh yeah, we'll support al-Sharaa, we'll support the country. A year ago, you were bombing people to support Assad. So it's not the group or the institution that they particularly care about, because their actions say that they don't. They supported Assad and bombed the people. Now all of a sudden, they want to be the new opposition's best friend. It's because they have their interest. They want access to the ports. They have strategic ambitions for which they want to use Syria and other countries as a home base. And it's really a longer-term strategic issue to counter NATO.
Is it possible, though, that while al-Sharaa might not support Russian presence and influence in the country, that there are people who are also in decision-making positions who see it differently? And is al-Sharaa going to be able to keep them at his pace?
Yeah, I got zero indication there's anybody in government who feels differently, and I think they're all being screened for that reason, to ensure that there's a uniformity of policy viewpoints. You don't have that, particularly in a country where you've got disparate cabinet institutions coming together to try to form a governing body that don't necessarily have an established relationship or not working together, right? So in some cases, you may have a former HTS member that's there as part of a ministry, but like, for example, went to go see the director of civil aviation, the guy who runs the airports and everything else in the country, right? Expat, owned a big company in Dubai on the aviation side, well suited for the job. There's a Ba'ath Party office on the first floor that's no longer occupied, right? Because the Syrian Ba'ath Party had to have a political officer. What do you need a political officer for at an aviation department? The last thing I want is some bozo who has no background in aviation, making policy decisions related to airports, because it's kind of ridiculous. So all of that political influence is gone, but uniformity in terms of policy viewpoints, particularly on the foreign side, I found across the board, regardless of sect or whether or not they were HTS or they were expats who returned. So I don't see it. Where you do have issues is there's still foreign powers that are meddling across the country for their own interests.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, and we'll get there too. But
yep,
let's go into Iran as
yep,
well. And
yep.
Iran is in an incredibly weakened state based on mostly Israeli action. But of course, we can't forget the summer when the U.S. struck some of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. So, how deep are their incursions when it comes to trying to have any kind of uh, diplomatic or economic or intelligence involvement in this neighbor?
Great question. So, I mean, for the folks that are on, if you're not familiar with the Shia crescent, right? So you basically have Iran, 97% Shia Muslim, converted by the Safavid dynasty, brought in scholars from Lebanon to do that. The population is Shia in terms of a sect of Islam, right? Next door in Iraq, about 60% Shia majority. When Saddam was overthrown, we have a democratic government that elects a Shia majority that's got now friendly relations with Tehran, much better, obviously, than Saddam did. They fought a war in the 80s. Then next door in Syria, you had a 10%, just about 10 to 12% minority Shia subsect Alawites represented by Assad that was then ruling over the combined 90% majority from all the other ethnic groups. And then once again, next door in southern Lebanon, you have Shia elements there, obviously under the control of Hezbollah. So for a while, Tehran basically had foreign policy and logistics control from Tehran through Baghdad to Damascus to southern Lebanon, which allowed them to move equipment and weaponry and everything else for Hezbollah and other, groups that were fighting the Israelis. So they've always looked at Syria as a strategic logistics transit point for which they were able to rearm and group with Hezbollah, which was stood up by Iran because Hezbollah was comprised of ethnic Arabs who speak Arabic as opposed to folks who speak Farsi or Persian, that are Iranian that are there. So anyway, in this case, al-Sharaa and team, they fought against the Iranian-backed militias and Hezbollah inside of Syria that were trying to support the Assad regime. And so you still see both Russia and Iran, supporting elements of the former regime, which are largely along the coast. A lot of former Alawite, officials who again are a small group. But they do represent the former regime. So they're still playing in that sense, and the goal is still to try to reestablish a logistics network to support Hezbollah. But what I found consistently across the government, whether it was HTS or technocratic officials that were expats, when it came to dealing with countries, from one of the officials, and because it was, I don't think we had permission to share a name, but one of the ministers, when talking about foreign investments, basically looked and said, we'll take money from wherever it comes, provided it's legal, from everybody except for Iran, quote, over my dead body.
Well, you can't get much stronger than that.
Yeah. They want
Uh,
nothing to do with it.
okay, but let's also talk about Israel. You had
Yep.
mentioned Israel. I mean, when you have a country that has similar enemies, but then you also get struck when you're trying to
Yeah.
rebuild, what does al-Sharaa think of Netanyahu and Israel?
So, I mean, not having spoken to the president while we were there, and certainly not about Netanyahu in terms of having a personal opinion, but do having kind of a sense for where both sides are on the issue. So, having met with the Israelis in a delegation back in March, very early on, the comments that came back were, we were attacked by like having a group of radical jihadists on our border that attacked on 10/7. We can't afford to have another group like that on our borders, leaving a strategic threat to the country. They're saying the right things, but we'll see what they actually do. And the Israeli phrase for that was, quote, distrust but verify, right? And so from the Syrian perspective on the other side, hey, we fought Hezbollah, we fought, Iran, we fought the regime, everybody else who was a threat. We should be on the same page. And they were having trouble understanding in many cases why there was this animosity. You still have the issue over the Golan Heights, which the Syrians are not going to give up a claim to, because that provides strategic, literally, oversight and to be able to fire into Israel, which they've taken for a long time, which became problematic. But for the Syrians, there was some consternation, right? So to your point, I think they thought they had some agreement earlier on with the Israelis about how things would go. They were concerned, the Israelis were concerned about the Druze down south, which is its own interesting story in terms of the actors who were playing inside of Syria there on the Druze side. But there's a historic relationship where they were the first ethnic minority recognized by the Israeli government after 48, and they have a close relationship. They serve in the IDF, and there's communities across the border in Syria, but they only make up 3% of the total population. They're not significant in terms of a national actor to take more, just like to take a prominent role sort of in government. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I was with the defense minister and his aides, and the Israelis hit the defense ministry while they were in there to try to send a message, so to speak, which was difficult. But even through all of that, they said, look, we're looking for peace. We're looking for stability. I mean, the statements have come out publicly now, so I'm not revealing anything that was told in secret. But essentially, the goal to move towards a security agreement based on the 1974 historic agreement with the Israelis, followed by some sort of ceasefire, and then eventually an Abraham Accords type style thing down the road. But there's issues they have to work out. But they have zero desire to be fighting. And the Israelis are now consistently, I think, seeing a bit more that the Syrians are sort of meaning what they're saying in their actions. And that's more important, which is why we had more substantive discussions about joining, the counter-ISIS coalition. And you saw a lot of that during Admiral Cooper's visit where they were talking about it. So very pleased with the trajectory of that, but a lot of mistrust and a
Wait,
lot
okay,
of
but let's,
pause.
I guess I feel like I'm not quite sure where we're left with that answer, Alex,
Sure,
because,
go ahead.
is Syria now a supporter of Israel, or are they remaining neutral on Israel? Um,
Um, it's an interesting question, the way to phrase it, right? In terms of supporter, I think they're a neighbor, right? They recognize them as a neighbor that they don't want to end up in sort of a war with. I think they see a number of mutually aligned, goals there when it comes to regional groups and threats. And I think they would just sort of like to coexist in peace. So I think at the moment it's trying to establish a peaceful coexistence and then trying to strengthen the relationship afterwards, if that makes sense.
mhm. What about Turkey? Because speaking of
Interesting.
neighbors, this is a country that
Yeah.
has played a major role.
Yeah.
HTS was very much empowered by Turkey, providing safe refuge and a way to get money and weapons through. How much of an influence are they playing as we describe these different dynamics?
They're playing a pretty significant and outsized role. So in Syria, from the beginning of the war, going back 10 years ago, you had different groups supporting different factions in there, right? But the SDF, the U.S. basically backed the Kurdish side that was up there. You have HTS right now, and they had a lot of support from the Turkish government. And then you had the Russians supporting Assad's folks, and the Iranians supporting the Assad folks, and the militias on the ground. And then so you
I
have
mean,
all these.
Syria is just this crazy country that is a
Yeah,
mix of
yeah.
like a geopolitical chessboard as well as an exercise in how you actually conduct counterterrorism, right and wrong. So it's like it is a crazy nexus for so many things. But for the moment, where do we see Turkey exerting influence, and is that a bad thing?
So Turkey's been on the sidelines a little bit lately while the government's trying to work out an agreement with the SDF, who flew in on U.S. helicopters with Tom Barak and the and Admiral Cooper looked like were there for a visit as well to try to get an agreement between the Kurds and the U.S. Excuse me, between the Kurds, the Kurdish SDF, and then the new government that's there, where the Turks were backing. But prior to that, throughout the war, the Turks were backing the military movements of the current government to help them overthrow, and they've had a significant role. And President Erdogan in Turkey has established a very conservative political base. So, in response to the war in Gaza, he's been very outspoken, anti Israeli in his rhetoric. And it really irked the Israelis, who see him as the long term strategic threat to Israel. And Syria sort of as the playground that acts as the buffer zone to keep the Turks away or at bay from any potential action with Israel, even though I don't see that from the Turks as well. I see this more as political with him speaking to his base. But it was a genuine concern for the Israelis. So now, how do you sort of act against that and how do you keep that from happening? So the goal here for the international community has to be to ensure that the SDF and the HTS government is able to come together in a peaceful manner for whatever that's going to look like, because the country really cannot afford another civil war or any internal fighting. And for foreign direct investment to take hold, which is really necessary to rebuild, they need a stable security environment. And until there is unity and cohesion in the country, it's going to make it difficult to do that, which was the message we got across the board from the ministers that we talked to in Syria. The international parties need to ensure that everybody stops supporting these little factions that are fighting in terms of violence and get everybody to come to the table for a peaceful agreement so we can move forward collectively.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the sectarian violence
Yeah.
shortly, but I do want to know, going back to Turkey, Hakan Fidan, he
Yep.
is Turkey's foreign minister.
Yep.
He used to be head of Turkish intelligence for MIT, the National Intelligence Organization.
Yep.
That is no coincidence in my book. He has a track record of playing all sides, and I just want to understand more about the role that Turkey plays in what al-Sharaa and what the leadership will be doing.
So I think Turkey will continue to play a role. I think the Syrians, I think, would prefer, if they could, to try to limit the foreign powers' involvement, because everybody believes they're owed something for helping sort of get to an independent state, and that was mentioned. Not only Turkey but several other states in the region. And the Syrians are like, hey, everybody wants to slice the pie, but the pie belongs to Syria, and that's the Syrian people. So I think, given the level of support that they've had to date, and until this situation is resolved, in terms of the disparate parties and the lack of unity, I think the Turks will continue to sort of play an outsized role as a state sponsor. But then that also comes with, what about reconstruction? As more states start to engage and there's funding in those things, more people will sort of have more influence going in. The Turks are concerned, obviously, about having an undefined Kurdish presence with control of territory, and in some areas that are not even majority Kurdish. And there's a lot of oil and gas up north, and that's the other reason why there's a lot of issues with it when it comes to control for that territory up there, because of the Kurdish independence movement inside of Turkey, with several designated terrorist groups having participated in campaigns against the Turkish state for a long time, and others who will have an independence movement, some that are political. So obviously they took them years to kind of work together, develop a relationship with the Kurdish government in northern Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan. I don't think there's no appetite for federalism of that style inside of Syria, either from the Turks or the Syrian government. They want to have a unified country. So therein lies the rub. The Kurds are once again left without a state, and that becomes the problem.
Yeah, that seems to be the norm. No matter what administration, what regime we're talking about, the Kurds never seem to get
Precisely.
their state. They never get their support. They don't
Yeah.
have that stability. Um,
Precisely.
anyway, yeah. Um, well, when it comes to sectarian violence, the Druze, the Alawite, the
Yeah.
Christians, is that going to be able to address? Will al-Sharaa be able to maintain control, or is this a problem that is going to get worse, especially when we're still seeing slower efforts to rebuild the country?
No, it's a great question. I mean, the ethnic or sectarian violence that's plagued the region for a long time has been there. It's got historic roots to different conflicts that predate this. But in terms of as it relates to Syria now, um, majority of that violence or tension exists in the edges of the country outside the capital, right? So if you're in Damascus, you're walking around, you get Damascus goggles, we'll call it. I visited a number of the minority sects while I was there in their areas in the city and talked to them in private without government minders. They're not having any problems. From the Shia to the Alawites that were around, the few that were there, Kurds that we ran and spoke to with different folks, they didn't have that problem. But there are still areas, like you said, and that really depends on the political motivation of a lot of the groups who want their own independent state in many cases, where that's runs counter to what the government's trying to achieve in Syria now, which is a unified state. So,
So how
um,
does the government achieve a unified state when we're discussing the fact that there are these different factions with their own
sure.
motivations and uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Strategies and levels of hatred of others.
Certainly. Yeah, it makes sense. I think, part of that discussion naturally becomes, well, if you want your own country, we're not looking at a federalized system here. We're looking at a central government. And so what does that mean in terms of participation? Is it more inclusion and having more folks from these disparate groups in more senior level government positions? Are there concessions that need to be made on territorial localized control, or when it comes to energy assets? I think all of those things are sort of in play for discussion. And whether or not they're able to solve those, or whether there's continued violence, will depend on the ability of those actors to compromise. Because at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to, right? A deal's got to be good for both sides in order for a deal to happen. In most cases, both parties usually walking away not totally happy in a good deal, unless somebody's got enough power where they're able to pull the levers in their favor and kind of force capitulation of what they want. So I think, I did get the sense that the Turks are not going to sit on the sidelines for forever, and that the government's patience will eventually run out. But there's a commitment to a peaceful process, so long as that the folks are really looking to do that in good faith. So, we saw some promising signs the last couple of days with the SDF. I think things have calmed down with the Druze a little bit now. And unfortunately, this is a country that was waging war for 10 years with people looking for independence, and there's still remnants of that throughout the country, and that's going to take a little time to resolve itself.
And I know you had mentioned Al-Hol, which is a refugee
Yeah,
camp that contained ISIS families.
yeah,
What's the latest on that?
great
And
question.
yeah, good.
So I mean,
I won't say anything. I'm going to end it
no,
with a great question. You go.
no, it was perfect. I mean, it's a strategic problem in the sense that there were, between all the camps, you had tens of thousands of people that were left sort of locked up. So whether it was former fighters, or in Al-Hol, the case where you've got family members who were there, right? So women and children. A lot of the women were non-Syrian, non-Iraqi nationals from other countries, could be from the West, and then children. Some of them radicalized, some of them not. And then and at the Iraqi side, in some cases, the boys, when they turned to older teenagers, are then sent to adult male prison, which is sort of acting like a terrorist finishing school, which is the last thing you want. So what do you do with this population, right? One, it's expensive to run these camps, and it's not good to do this in perpetuity. People need to leave there. So the Ministry of Social Welfare and Labor there is they're kind of working on a training and micro grant program to get women out of there, give them skills, help them open a business, help them transition out. That's happening, but a lot of it is cash, right? And Al-Hol's also up north under the SDF control. You've got camps in northern Iraq under the Kurdish regional government, but Iraqi state. So you've got a number of players that are involved, right? But it needs to be handled carefully, because the last thing you want is tens of thousands of radicalized people being released from prisons in a very vulnerable state that's still recovering from war, quite frankly, right? And they don't need any more instability internally. So the international community, I think, quite frankly, hasn't done enough to address the situation. And Western powers who have had citizens that are in those prison camps and chose to look the other direction because they didn't want to deal with it or repatriate it are really not helping. Right. And I realize that nobody wants to deal with that problem set. And, we kind of sucked collectively at de-radicalization over the last 25 years. The ping pong and ice cream cone and jobs program hasn't been the best, with a 50% recidivism rate back to the battlefield. Still better than nothing, but that's a perpetual problem that we have yet to figure out collectively as a community how to deal with effectively. We've been marginally successful, is what I would describe it as. I think people who've worked it will say they were super successful. When you got 50% of people still returning to the battlefield, you got some work to do.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the people who have been growing up there and
Yeah.
whether they have been further radicalized just from proximity,
Right.
where this leads, and it's just an open question. This is maybe one of my most consistent
Sure.
areas of wondering as a journalist of what becomes of this place, of these people,
Yeah.
and do we end up ultimately seeing an ISIS 2.0 that takes an entirely different form? I mean, we've seen ISIS affiliates and their decentralized structure as having created a resurgence since the 2014, supposed caliphate. But
Sure.
what becomes of the people in those camps and where al-Sharaa fits in terms of his plan? I'm interested in that.
Sure. Of what to do with that.
Yeah.
So I apologize if you see a little movement, folks. Just plugged in my phone there. So I apologize, wasn't enough battery. So I think the plan, like I said, in speaking to the Ministry of Social Welfare, that's responsible for the reintegration, they've got a plan that's kind of based in transitioning folks back into society is how they'd like to deal with it, but they need more funding and outside support to make that more successful. The only good news is that ISIS is so conservative and radicalized in their viewpoints that they find themselves at war or these declared enemies with both HTS in Syria, all the way to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they always say politics makes for some strange bedfellows. So does terrorist ideologies apparently, because in the United States continues to partner with the Taliban as the ground element inside of Afghanistan to deal with ISIS. And the elements that we care about have largely been pushed out up in north into Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. According to the NCTC directors, the last three that I've spoken to from both parties, everybody has the same viewpoint on that. They've done a decent job in that sense. And Al Qaeda main sort of Afghanistan, Pakistan is no longer even cracking the top 10 threats. We've got a significant problem in Central and Western Africa. Huge swath, half the United size of the United States. That's a problem, particularly after the vacuum left from the base, handover in Niger. I mean, just problem everywhere. Wagner goes in Africa is also a mess. And then you get into Syria, which is more
Russia's
questionable.
paramilitary group, yes. And yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
that area is a hotbed for terrorism. Absolutely.
right.
Where do
Yeah,
you see the United States and Syria effectively partnering? It sounds like
sure.
counterterrorism is number one.
So I think it's number one for a few reasons, right? The Syrians have other bigger things on their agenda for reconstruction, but if you look at the concerns that the Israelis have expressed about Syria and their long-term trajectory, it's always rooted around the fact that it's like, can you ever really be a reformed jihadist? Can you ever really be a former Al Qaeda turned Al Nusra turned HTS actor and really be a responsible, neighbor and state actor? Well, the only way you're going to do that is through demonstrated competency in these areas, right? So if the violent, jihadists belonging to ISIS are a threat to you and your regime, and you're not working with those folks, then you should have no problem going after them and pursuing them, which I think the regime recognizes, and they want they need to be able to get those extremist elements under control. And the good thing is, just as we learned with our incursions in other countries, um, I mean, if you take a look at Gaddafi and Saddam and even some of the other actors, we didn't enter there because of terrorist problems, right? Many cases, it was, weapons of mass destruction or it was other issues. Because those terrorist elements are a threat to those dictators as much as they are to a democratic state. It doesn't matter the form of government. The fact that it's secular and non-religious in nature is what they're offended by, and it doesn't meet their standard for governance. So that's where it becomes unique, and there's that commonality amongst the actors there. That's a common threat. But then what happens? Are there other terrorist groups who don't subscribe to that ideology, who are also counter-U.S. or counter-Western, values, alliances, whatever, that we have to worry about? And so those are the things you watch on the margins. But I think the first step for them is a solid campaign to go after ISIS, right? But for them, they're also saying, look, we have internal stability we need to deal with before we can shift focus to the counterterrorism mission. And we share a long border with Iraq that's very porous, with a history, like you said, of ISIS. So there are some genuine concerns. And again, I think the state sees the threat from ISIS, and particularly cross-border in that region between Syria and Iraq, to the government as a significant threat to them. And so, again, that's the commonality.
Hmm. When I think about al-Sharaa and his transformation,
Yeah,
um, it's just, what
it's remarkable.
I mean, it's such a bizarre transition. I don't know if is there another example of anybody quite like him. Um, because there are certainly leaders who try to befriend the United States. They tell the United States what the United States wants to hear about women's rights and minority rights, and
Right, right.
they paint the picture that they know
Sure.
U.S. What democracy is supposed to look like. And then when it comes to actually executing they have something very, very different in mind.
Yeah,
And time shows. Uh, is
it
that
does.
going to happen here? I guess is my last question to you. Are you
So
feeling optimistic, or is there still a shred of skepticism in you from this?
I mean, just given my time in government service and dealing with threat actors, there's always skepticism whenever I look at these situations. But in terms of optimism, you had a country that was under severe sanctions that need to recover, and rebuild, which they would never be able to do under the sanctions regime. That was conducting outreach for common threats and a desire to reintegrate and join, the world community. And then sort of taking steps to get there. And so the choice was really either for the West to engage and lift the sanctions, or they would have no choice but to turn to a sanctions busting country network to be able to move money and cash and oil and gas and everything else necessary to rebuild the country in the best way that they could. And so it really became a question of, is the West, collective West between the US, Europe, et cetera, going to do that, or are we going to allow them to turn to the Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, Venezuela, Cuba network of folks? And I think the administration went back and forth on this for a while, particularly with the Israelis, and landed on the fact that we need to give this a shot. President lifted the sanctions. We're looking to work with them, and so I think to the extent that that continues, we'll be in good shape. I think we're going to continue to monitor, the government there and ensure that they're meeting their commitments. But everything remains positive and hopeful for right now. The biggest next thing to watch will be the peaceful, reintegration and of the different sects right now that hold different areas of the country and their ability to do that. If they can do that, and then they pivot to really that counter ISIS mission and focus on it, I think it's going to set conditions that'll allow them to continue to move down the road with Western powers and further away from those threat actors that we don't want to see returning to the Middle East in a more significant way.
Right. Does this become another Libya, or does it forge a different path? And
Yeah.
on the Trump administration's deliberations, this was a rare place where the president received praise from some Democrats for
Yeah.
extending that olive branch to al-Sharaa. So, Alex, thank you for telling us about your trip. I didn't get around to asking you how the food was. So,
Amazing.
yeah, it's
Quite
good.
happy. It was great.
Yeah.
Damascus is, like I said, was untouched. A lot of restaurants are functioning, and then you go to the small little shops on the outskirts of the city or the food carts or the stands, and traditional Arab food, particular, to that country in terms of some of the cuisine. But great kebabs, rice, salads, and bread anywhere you go. That's all I need to be happy. So it
Well,
was amazing.
I'm glad we got that in. For everybody who's been watching us live, we appreciate it. For everyone who watches it later, thank you for joining. You can follow Alex's work. He tweets a lot, or X's a lot. I still don't know.
Sorry.
I can't get with the program, but he's at Alex Plitsas, his name on Twitter. And I got to plug myself too. Paid subscribers, I love you guys because you let me do
Yeah.
this work and you help me continue. For everybody else, if you can share it or if you can like it, that's also welcome. But it's great to see you, Alex, and I will look forward to catching up again soon.
You're the best. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Sasha.